So, good evening. Surprisingly, the library of the IWM is packed with people. Seriously, I think for this event we could have easily filled the ranks of the book theater for tonight. Very warm welcome to all of you. I'm Ludger Hagedorn, permanent fellow here at the IWM, Institute for Human Sciences. Warm welcome to all of you here in the library, and a very warm welcome also to those very many people who will be following us tonight in the live stream that we are doing. And in fact, I think the live stream very much makes up for us not being at the book theater tonight. And not only does it make up for it, maybe it's even better to have it this way. So good evening again. My welcome to all of you here in the IWM. And my second and more difficult task for this short opening is also to welcome the two people on stage. This is the more difficult thing to do. Firstly, I will not introduce the two of them to you. You know why you decided to come here tonight. And I will not tell you that it was the right decision to do so. So this we have done. You know whom to expect. Secondly, literally, I can also not really welcome Tim and Ivan, because not only are they permanent fellows to the IWM, but I think they are the two who very much have shaped over the last 15 or more years what in fact the IWM is, what it stands for, and why it is the, well, a bit remarkable place in Vienna that it is. So I cannot welcome the two of you, but I can express my gratitude to both of you for doing this work that you have done over the recent years. And thank you for not only being here with us tonight, but for all of that, what you are contributing to making the IWM the place that it is. And I would want to express this gratitude also on behalf of my colleagues, also your colleagues, on behalf of the very great staff of IWM, and on behalf of the very many friends and fellows of the Institute. It's great to have both of you here. Going over to the talk of tonight, the last time that these two people were on stage here was in June 2023. It's only 20 months ago. I listened into it again this afternoon, and when listening to it, it seems that some of the topics have happened decades ago. It's really surprising how accelerated our world of today is. It was a discussion in June 2023, just after the attempted coup of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Very much of the talk was circling around that. Tim Snyder in the talk was also very much speaking about the intricate logic of nuclear deterrence. And he was warning against the option of nuclear blackmailing, a thing that is as valid and as true today as it was then. And even Krastev said the remarkable words, the most difficult is to distinguish between decay and collapse, he said at that time. And he was speaking about Russia. He was speaking about Putin's Russia at that time. When saying that these 20 months later, everything has changed so much, I think we have the impression that what Ivan then said about Russia, we could say about the whole world today. And in fact, sometimes we don't even know the old patterns that we were used to. If we are still before the collapse or already after the collapse, it has become so intricate and so complicated. And one thing that would be very easy, looking at the developments that we are seeing in the world today, to make fun of it. It's suspiciously easy to make fun of it, right? The much more difficult thing is to make sense of it. This is what the two will try to do tonight. So the floor is yours. Tim and Ivan, or Krastev and Snyder, please.
Thank you. I'm more local, so I'll start. And this is a very special format which we decided to do. This is totally kind of following the logic of the American foreign policy these days, which means no transcripts, pure improvisation. None of us knows basically what we are going to do. Secondly, when I was coming here, the mood particularly, you know that there was a lot of information today about the conversation between the American president and the Russian president and what they are preparing for Ukraine. I was reminded of a story which stayed with me. It's a story told by a Bulgarian painter from the 1920s. And he's talking about a guy going to a doctor and saying, listen, I'm slightly in a depressive, suicidal mood. And the doctor looked at him and asked him questions and said, it's true. You're very kind of a profoundly melancholic, and the only thing that you should do in order to get out of this situation, every single night, you should go to the circus. And particularly you should focus on the clown because it's a very gifted one and is going to change your atmosphere. And the guy said, but is this the only option? And the guy said, yes. And he said, then there is no option because I'm the clown. I'm saying this because in a certain way, we're in a situation really trying to make sense. And Tim is just coming from Ukraine. He's an American. He was very much involved with the American campaign. So if you're going to ask me about the genre of this conversation, it's much more comparing intuitions. And secondly, when 2016, Donald Trump was elected for the first time, and it was a kind of a blind dating with power back then, Tim wrote a Facebook post, which after that became a book, and one of the most important books, in my view, produced as a part of this presidency. This was his book on tyranny. And what was interesting about the book was also that he said, this is the end of the American exceptionalism. If America tries to understand the world, it should get outside of its own history. And he very much put the history of East European dissidents and others as the way to understand how to behave, because his major approach was that there are certain regimes that you understand only by resisting them. I'm saying this before going to him, because for me, when I was seeing how the world is unfolding, I was very much reminded of 1989. Not simply because you see a making of the world of 1989, but this sense of a big, profound change that can go in different directions. On Friday, you cannot believe what we have been believing on Monday. This kind of a sense of a profound change, personally, as somebody being 25 years back then, being in Bulgaria and not in Poland and so on, probably made a very strong impression on me. So I want to start the conversation with this, and I'm very much interested, Tim, on the story of the scale of the change. Obviously, we're seeing a change. And this is not just a change of president, it's not just a change of a policy, it's not what about is going to happen in Europe or Ukraine, but in my view something much more profound is changing. Some of the key words that have been running our world are not there anymore. Some of the cultural frames with which we have been understanding what is going on are not there. Do you share this feeling, or do you believe it's kind of too idiosyncratic to be true?
Okay, thanks, Ivan. First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here and thank the Institute for making this possible. It's always nice to come to Vienna, whensoever one is coming from. I want to start with the idea of jokes, because Ludger forbade us from making jokes, and then Ivan immediately made a joke, which I think is, and I'm essentially on Ivan's side in this. In that dispute, and I'm going to tell you why. The first thing is that the worse things get, the funnier they also get, and it's a shame to miss that, at least up to a certain point, right? So I don't know how much American humor you're following, but Americans have suddenly gotten a lot funnier, and we're going to keep getting funnier for a while. And then we'll see, because there's an authoritarianism is funny, but a totalitarianism is not, and that's when you can tell, right? That's when you can tell you've lost it, when people start. But right now, I've never known Americans to be funnier than they are right now. And the related thing is, and it relates to freedom and what freedom is. When I think of the time that I've spent with the people who are now running the United States, and I have spent a little time with some of them, and when I think of how they look, I really don't have the impression that they're having a good time. And I think this is something which is actually quite worth noting. I don't think they're happy. I don't think Elon Musk is happy. I don't think Donald Trump is happy. And I don't even think they can even do a very good impression of being happy. Like if you look at them at the moments when they're like trying to smile and like, I mean, what is less convincing than Elon Musk jumping on a stage? Like that's the least convincing jump for joy in the history of jumping for joy. And Trump, when he smiles, he's only smiling from malice. And I think there's something actually quite significant here about what freedom is, because I think the way that America has gotten itself into the fix that it is in is by taking on what I'm calling in a very broad sense in the new book, a negative idea of freedom, where you're free because there are barriers and you break the barriers. You're free because there's a government and you break the government. And the problem with this kind of idea of freedom is that it ends up, you end up with the idea of the lonely hero who ends up breaking everything by himself. And the problem with that is that like then you're a lonely person amidst the rubble, which is where Musk is right now. Like he is embodying this idea. He is the libertarian who is quite literally destroying the government. And as he is doing it, he's breaking, like they like to say, he's moving fast and breaking things. But does anybody actually like him? And does he actually like anybody else? And is he happy? I think the answer to all three of those questions is no. And I think that's part of the disease where we are, where like the powerful are in a race, and the race is essentially, to nowhere. And and the reason I'm thinking about this, of course, has to do with something Yvonne said, which is that I was just in southeastern Ukraine a couple of days ago, not so terribly far from the front. And of course, in Ukraine, there is a kind of palpable trauma and suffering, and everyone that you know has lost someone, and you have lost people yourself. If you know any number of people in Ukraine, you've lost some of them by this point. It's been 3 years of an incredibly murderous war. And yet, at the same time, I don't want this to sound banal, but I don't know how to quite say it without sounding a little bit naive. At the same time, people in Ukraine that I know still smile and laugh. They smile and laugh more than the people running the United States of America. And I think that's interesting too, because I think that is in fact a sign of freedom. I think finding things funny and being able to smile is a sign that you're still a free person, that you still care about things. And so I guess part of what I'm pointing to here is a kind of separation between power and freedom, and that's one way of thinking about where we are today. Like there are still free people. There are still people who are doing things that they ought to do. And by the way, this is also like a striking sense of contrast when I come back. When I come back from Ukraine to Austria, the sense of contrast is not based upon things being peaceful here and warlike there. The sense of contrast is based upon Ukrainians actually doing things, and Austrians and other Europeans asking, well, what will the strongmen do? What is Putin about to do? What is Trump about to do? And that seems to be a very fundamental difference. And I will notice that nobody ever says, what is Putin about to do and what is Trump about to do, and then smile afterwards, right? And so I think there's a sense in which like having a notion of freedom in which you are able to do things for yourself and in which you're agents makes people happy. Not that they always win, right? But there's a sadness to when they lose, which has to do with the loss of something human. Which brings me towards, my attempt at like answering Yvonne's question at the highest level of what I think is going on now. I think the two metamorphoses, the two big metamorphoses which are going on now are the human losing out to the inhuman, and the other metamorphosis is money, is the metamorphosis of oligarchical money becoming destructive fantasy. So when I say the human becoming the inhuman, what I mean is that I think it's not just that we're losing some words, I think we're losing most of our words. It's a bit like if you remember the plot of Orwell's 1984, when they went through and manually removed words so that the vocabulary would be smaller, on the understanding that people would be easier to control if they had a smaller vocabulary. But I think we're all mechanically losing words all the time, right? The English that is becoming our English by way of the internet is a smaller and smaller vocabulary with fewer and fewer concepts, and the concepts are less and less human. And meanwhile, the social media is organizing our minds in such a way that we tend to see people as friends and enemies. We tend to have short attention spans. We tend to be much more predictable, and that brings me back maybe by a different route to the dissidents of the 1970s and 1980s. And the reason why I continue to think that they may be more useful now, even for me when I was writing On Tyranny, because On Tyranny was a book about how to defend things, and that's helpful, you know. And I'm both happy and sad that it's a #1 bestseller again, you know. Like I think this week it's #1 in the New York Times, and that's happy, but it's also melancholy. But the dissidents, many of them anyway, like I'm thinking of Václav Havel and Ivan Havel. Ivan Havel was a cyberneticist, and he had Václav's brother, and he had a weekly kind of workshop that I actually went to a few times in Prague. And the two of them were very concerned, and Václav was quite articulate about the notion of human predictability and human unpredictability. And it was thanks to them that I got to thinking about unpredictability as being at the heart of freedom. And I think like part of the way the human is giving way to the inhuman is that we're becoming more predictable. Like we most of us are becoming more predictable. We're becoming more, you know, prisoners of fear and anxiety. Who we like and who we don't like is more and more predictable. And but the knowledge of the predictability is held by fewer and fewer people, right? And meanwhile, shifting to the second point, the human unpredictability is being monopolized by a very few people. So there's like a kind of sick, degenerative way in which all the unpredictability has risen to the top. So even as we become, you know, more and more like a herd, or two herds that you can kind of drive against each other at will, there's way too much unpredictability at the top. So Musk again, like, or Musk and Putin, like they are way too unpredictable, and in a very dangerous way. So the second point, like a thing that we went very wrong, and this goes back to 1989, and you know, I'm the millionth person to make this point, but in 1989 we were much less concerned about the economic and social conditions for freedom in a positive way. People tended to think, I don't want to say we, because I'm sure a lot of you got this right at the time, but many people thought that the economic conditions for freedom were basically just negative. You know, so the walls come down, never actually did come down, by the way. The walls come down, you know, all we have to do is knock down those central plans and get rid of all those bureaucrats and have unrestrained capitalism, and then we'll have freedom. But not enough thought was given to like what happens when you get to something that, you know, people have worried about for 2,500 years, which is you have oligarchs who end up controlling the wealth. And so in this sense, like I think Putin and Musk are parallel developments. I mean, actually, I think parallel lives, where you get to a point where you have so much money that all that is left to you are fantasies of immortality of various kinds. And the fantasies that you have about this world, no one can stop you from trying to fulfill them. So like if we think about where we are precisely today, we're at a collision of Putin's oligarchical fantasy that there is no Ukraine, with Musk's oligarchical fantasy that we should privatize the entire American government. Those two things are now coming together in a moment where, going back to the question from Yvonne from last year of whether it's decay or collapse, it's like thanks to oligarchy, Russia and America are racing to the bottom, and it's kind of a competition as to who's going to get there first. And on the way, they're having this little encounter, which has to do with Ukraine. But the thing I guess that I would stress before I end this is that even in this world that I'm describing with these dark metamorphoses, when I say it involves Ukraine, I'm not saying that Ukraine therefore becomes predictable. Like it's not at all clear that I meant to say Trump actually. It's a funny mistake. That when Trump and Putin meet, they can actually determine much of anything at this point. And I think we kind of have to ask ourselves, what has happened to us that we're so entranced by the spectacle of these two people who regard as strong meeting, and what's happened to us that we are so inattentive to people who are actually free and their own agency and the things that they're trying to do. Okay, I'll stop.
Thank you, because I'll go on this because in a certain way we are talking about as if kind of a very catastrophic thing is happening. But I was seeing the survey which European Council on Foreign Relations have been doing after Trump was elected, and here are the figures. With the exception of Europe, and to be honest, Western Europe, South Korea, and United Kingdom, out of the 21 countries that have been polled, plurality and majority of the people believe that Trump is good for America, Trump is good for their country, and Trump is good for peace. This is Turkey, India, Saudi Arabia. This is many countries. He's coming to the world that in a certain way is waiting for him. And in my view, this is quite important because one of the countries that have been studied was Ukraine. And in Ukraine, there are more people who believed in this survey that basically he was going to make peace better than before. These people can have different views. Some probably believe he's going to give more weapons. Others believe that he's simply going for negotiations. But I'm saying this because one of the things, and I was going back to this all the time, when now I was thinking about 1989, what struck me more was the following. Now when you look back, you try to understand how much we have been focused on the fall of the Berlin Wall and how many things we did not see. Now when you look back, probably Tiananmen is more important than the fall of the Berlin Wall. The resilience of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese power allowed them to do things that we're seeing now. One of the two biggest economy, probably now the biggest economy in the world, major military power and others. Back then for us it was kind of a footnote, deviation. Something that is going to change in 10 years. By the way, in 2001, everybody is going to talk about 9/11. But it turned out that the decision China to enter World Trade Organization in 2001 has a much more consequences for the development of the world. And even because Kirill Rogov is here and I have been seeing some of the Levada Center's surveys from 2019, when you're asking the Russian public what was the most important event that happened in 1989, and they were given different options, the fall of the Berlin Wall, Polish elections, Tiananmen, majority of the Russians said the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan. The end of the empire was more important than the end of communism. And I'm saying all this because even when you're talking about Elon Musk, in 1989, 17-year-old white nerd from South Africa left the country, but I do believe that many of the things and many of the fears that he experienced back then is shaping his view of the world. In a certain way, he's seeing the world as a kind of a big South Africa where his own people are minority, and as a result of it, basically the only way is to run out of the world and to go to Mars. I'm saying this because my major question is what we are not seeing now when we're looking only at Trump. Probably there's things that we are not seeing. Probably there's other things that are happening and which in my view are important because also talking about Musk, and of course he's very interesting and all these people are very different. But one of the things that struck me listening to all this analysis of how he thinks, what he wants was in fact two things. First, it was a sentence that he said that every single day I'm thinking about the end of the Roman Empire. This preoccupation with decline. There is a major decline, there is a civilizational decline, you should reverse it. And I'm here and I'm on a mission and I don't have time. So this kind of apocalyptic story, which you don't see at least when you are looking at the Indians or Turks or others. So my story is also to what extent basically what we are seeing very much is much more the crisis of the West. And from this point of view, I agree very much with Tim that the words are critical. If you see what Trump changed most is not what America is doing, but how America is speaking. For example, he can decide to continue giving weapons to Ukraine. We cannot basically exclude this, but it's always going to be, and then they're going to pay us. with 500 billion out of natural resources and so on. This is the world in which the only thing that is legitimate is a very crude national interest. In a certain way, the cynics are the only person to be trusted. Anybody who claims that something is a common interest or something is a win-win game, he's a liar. And I do believe this is important because this is more radical than anything else. And this is the world, for example, in which there is no allies. When people said that he's trying to remake the world with tariffs and so on, to be honest, Biden tried to do this with sanctions. The idea to use the economic weapon was not something that was not used by the previous administration, but in this world of Biden, it was allies, ideological enemies, and so on, and you using the economic weapon for here and there. So in the world of tariffs, there is no people. There is trade imbalances. In a certain way, you are not interested in what is happening in these societies. You are not interested in who is governing. You are not interested in anything which is happening in. And I found this important, and this is why I want to go back to Tim, because when I'm trying to understand what happened on the elections 2024, and I should confess that on this, because normally political scientists, we are always trying to find one time when we were right. On this one, I was sure that Trump is winning, so I'm never going to forget this because of this kind of statistical story that I got it right. But the most interesting is his major message to the American voters was, trust me because I care about nobody else, only you. I don't care about Ukrainians, Russians, Chinese, and so on. The only thing that matters is you. And I'm saying this because going to Tim and trying to see how he's seeing this, what I'm afraid is that we're going to see also in places like Europe such a major restructuring because our politics is going to be reduced to clash of two different types of nationalisms. One is the nationalism that you see now on the far right, which is very much inspired by Trump. It talks much more about immigration, be gender, be climate. And on the other side is going to be the nationalism of, I'm not going to allow to bully me, what you're seeing in Canada, with basically Canadian government, what you're seeing in South Africa. So if you have a trade tariffs, I'm going to put the tariffs too. So you try to mobilize public support with a different type of anti-Trumpian nationalism. I'm saying this because as a result of it, this is a kind of a really deep crisis of internationalism because there is no internationalist anymore. In a certain way, you're just going to have the clash between two different types of nationalisms, which are, by the way, not the same, because one at least try to be more inclusive and others. So I'm very much interested how you see this type of a change that that goes beyond technology, and to what extent also we're not focusing too much on Trump, and probably he's not so representative for the rest of the world.
Yeah, let me start with the fall of the Roman Empire.
Are you thinking every day about it?
Well, I mean, not to sound arrogant, but I don't have to think about it every day. Because I know something about it, which means that like my mind is perhaps free of the relentless stereotypes about it, to which Musk is referring. I'm going to so you can't leave like unless a fire alarm sounds or something. So now I'm going to tell you something about the end of the Roman Empire, which is maybe just a tiny bit apropos. You can decide for yourselves. So the Goths killed a Roman emperor in the late 4th century, and they sacked Rome, which was of course no longer the capital, but they sacked Rome in the early 5th century. And then they replaced essentially the Roman administrative structure for a while. They ran Italy for a while. They ended up running Spain for several centuries. The Goths were not just barbarians. They clearly had sophisticated political ideas and practices of their own. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to replace the Romans and govern big bits of Europe for centuries. So the first point is like the fall of the Roman Empire might not be the big deal that people tend to think that it is. And when you get replaced, it might be because other people were doing it better than you. Like that happens too, right? It's funny how all these people who claim that they're friends of competition are then suddenly worried about being replaced. Because isn't another word for replaced outcompeted? Anyway. So if they were really in favor of competition, they shouldn't be in favor of replacement. But the slightly more apropos point, and you can just take this with a grain of salt or a kilogram of salt, but why were the Goths in Europe in the first place, destroying European structures? Well, because the Goths were from Ukraine, as nobody ever remembers. They're from Ukraine. I've been testing this in European museums, one after the other, where the Goths figure. Nobody ever mentions they're from Ukraine, because nobody ever mentions that anything is from Ukraine. But the Goths were from Ukraine. And why were the Goths in Europe? The Goths were in Europe because they were conquered by the Huns. And then the Huns and the Goths created the kind of political synthesis, which then in one way or another upended the entire European structure. Do I have to spell this out? I'm going to have to spell this out. So if you let the Ukrainians go, it doesn't just mean that Ukraine ceases to be a bother to you or it ceases to exist. If you let the Ukrainians go and Russia actually wins this war, you will not just be facing Russia. You'll be facing Russia with Ukrainian territory, Ukrainian agricultural resources, Ukrainian mineral resources, Ukrainian access to the sea, but also Ukrainian human resources, which is not a nice point for Ukrainians, and I'm sorry, but it's true. And the Ukrainian army is now the best army in Europe by far. I mean, by far. So if you let the Ukrainians go, the Huns don't just stay, right? The Huns bring the Goths with them to Europe. That's what happened in the 5th century. If you let the Ukrainians go, the Huns bring the Goths with them to Europe. And you won't withstand that. You won't withstand, okay. If you had been nodding when I made the analogy, I wouldn't have had to spell the whole thing out, but you didn't nod, so I spelled the whole thing out. Okay, so with respect, so then broadly on this question of I think the way that I agree with you that it's a crisis of the West, and I think the specific way that it's a crisis for the West and not for anybody else is that it's about whether post-imperial democracy is possible. Because this thing that we call democracy, for most of us in the West, was built during an age of imperial expansion, and in some way or another, with respect to subordinating local peoples or with respect to slavery, was organically connected to the empirical process. It never, there's some exceptions here and there, but as a rule, it didn't involve including everybody. And so then once imperialism in the conventional sense becomes close to impossible, once it's hard to conquer more land or once it's hard to enslave people, at least in the old-fashioned sense, then the question becomes, can you actually do democracy? And I think like your two kinds of nationalism are consistent with this, but I would point out that like one way to understand Trump is that you can do post-imperial politics by having the imperial bravado and the imperial prejudice, but without the imperial power. And I think that is actually where Trump is leading the US, where you can reject democracy and the rule of law, and you can pretend to be an empire all over again, and you can surround yourself with racists and so on. But and in doing that, you lose certain kinds of power that are associated with predictability and law and alliances. But you don't gain imperial power by doing that. Trump is not going to make the United States an empire capable of seizing. What is it today? I wasn't following, but is it, but we're not actually going to invade Gaza, Panama, Denmark, Greenland, Canada, and Mexico. We're not, in fact, a year from now, we'll meet again and Ludger will stand up and say, a year ago, Timothy Snyder did not anticipate the successful American occupation of Greenland. But I think we're actually, what Trump is doing is a certain kind of post-imperial politics, which is in a way the worst of both worlds, where you lose the dignity and power which comes from attempting to become a society of equals, but you don't gain the power that would come from being an empire because you can't manage it for various reasons. And I think, Yvonne, this may be where we differ a tiny bit, because I think that you can't really separate this from the digital and the technological, because I think the libertarianism which animates the current American regime has everything to do with the digital. Not just because a couple of digital oligarchs are at the center of it, but because I think their way of seeing the world. Not all of the digital oligarchs are like this, by the way, but the ones, the South African ones that are currently in charge are like this. And so then you have to disambiguate like what's South Africa and what's technology. But the way they see the world is to see government as essentially only a problem. And I think one thing which really is changing is that the United States is being disassembled from within. And so the United States as a predicate for other things we're talking about isn't really the same predicate as it used to be. That, you know, that when the United States takes apart the FBI, the CIA, the Department of the Treasury, and so on and so on and so on, at some point it isn't really the kind of state that one was used to talking about. And so then when we talk about Trump, we're talking about someone who is more and more performing the role, and with great talent, of course, and charisma, but performing the role of the strongman, while at the very same time the sources of strength are dissipating, right? Like this, his shoulder pads are meant to cover, you know, the disappearance of the state power behind him, which Musk's way of ruling, I think brings about. So I think of that. I think that's actually a kind of change in the nature of the kind of state we have, and it goes to even very basic things. Like you can't, here I think it's a bit different than Biden in that the Biden administration, for all one might criticize it, they had competent civil servants and they believed in policy instruments. And when they decided there was going to be a policy instrument, it was generally carried out by competent civil servants. The Trump people don't, I think, necessarily believe in policy instruments, and they may no longer have the civil servants in the right place to carry them out, even if they did. And even something which seems very simple, like a tariff, you still need you need competent civil servants to do a tariff. And if you go one step up from that to sanctions, we already didn't have enough people in the Department of Treasury to do sanctions under Biden. They were understaffed. And now, you know, could the United States actually do a sanctions regime? Or are those just words, right? You talked about words which no longer we use, but I think now the Americans are also in a realm where they use words, but there isn't actually anything behind those words.
It's interesting because when we talk about Trump, about nationalists are very much about the sacred nature of land. Land belongs to people, and you can defer to which people belongs, but land belongs to somebody. I was very much, of course, like everybody, intrigued by the way Trump was talking about Gaza. And listen, it's about gentrification of the world. He's seeing the land in the way a real estate person sees it. It's a bad neighborhood. And in this bad neighborhood, what you're doing, you're basically removing some people and you're making a new buildings. And these new buildings basically are kind of a different people are coming, and this is how you're developing the world. So from this point of view, yes, this is post-imperial, but the very idea of the empire believes that you want others to imitate you. Every empire is coming a model, and they basically has a civilizational mission, and it can be coded differently. I do believe that the interesting story, and it's not by accident, that one of the most influential political thinkers when it comes to Silicon Valley and this type of oligarchs is René Girard. And because I have been working with him for a while, the interesting story about Girard is fear your imitators. Because your imitators imitate you not because they want to be like you, but because they want to replace you. And from this point of view, it's interesting. Of course, I don't believe that Musk is the biggest reader of Girard, but Peter Thiel for sure is. And he was his student, and he was really reading this. And I find this interesting because when we talk about this new populism and people try to compare with the 1930s and what happened both on the left and on the right, I don't see much, to be honest, similarities. Because both the fascists and the communists, they wanted to change man. They believe in a new man. There was a project. It was a pedagogical regimes. They didn't like the people in the way they were. And then suddenly, Musk does not want to change you. Probably he can waste you somewhere. Probably he's not interested in you, but he's not in the business of changing you. And in my view, this has something to do, I very much agree with you, Tim, on this. Something dramatic has happened with the fact that we are living quite long, and some of us, particularly if they're slightly richer than us, they believe that you can live so long that it is almost immortality. Immortality is not a dream anymore, it is a project. You're going to see quite a lot of these people who basically believe that if they're doing gym when they're young, and then the medicine is going to develop so much that you can change organs and so on, and you can live for 200 years. And this is changing everything. It is changing the view, for example, of kids, because children is the embodied immortality. I'm dying, but my kids are going to stay there. You start to think in these generational terms. And suddenly, you are the last generation. You are not interested in this anymore. And suddenly, while people are starting to look immortal, nation starts to look mortal. You have all these kind of shrinking nations because of demography, because of migration, and so on. For example, for me, always the best example is South Korea. You know, those of you who are interested in demography, imagine that there is no migration in the world. So societies, in order to reproduce themselves, you should have 2.1 children per woman. In South Korea, it's 0.78. So as a result of it, South Korean society, which is not particularly friendly to migration, if something dramatically is not going to change, is going in 20 years to lose half of its population. This is dramatic. And the reasons are individual choices of people. I mean, obviously there is something wrong with South Korean marriage. Nobody's running about it. By the way, obsession with education. It's making very expensive to educate a child. But as a result of it, suddenly you can imagine, and I'm not talking about Bulgarians or Estonians or these small nations, which really cannot be sure that in 100 years anybody is going to speak their language, that they're going to be around. I do believe that this kind of a combination of anxiety about disappearing combined with this idea that we are going to stay forever is changing the way that we see humanity. And what is interesting about people like Musk, he does not want to change humanity. He believes that certain part of humanity should be saved, probably going to Mars, but others simply cannot be saved anymore. And this idea that people are not equal, in my view, is very important. By the way, in the way states are not equal. We are going to move to Ukraine, and I'm really interested how you see and what you saw. But if you see, as you know, for those of you who have not read the news, basically the news is that as a result of the conversation between the American president and the Russian president, several things now are becoming clear. They're going to meet. They're going to meet probably first in South Korea, but after that, Putin is going to visit the United States and Trump is going to visit Russia. So this is the end of any isolation of Russia. So this is, after all these comparisons with the World War II and Nuremberg and so on, basically this is a total normality. Secondly, basically, not simply that they're going to meet, but when they're going to meet, they're not going to be Ukrainians or Europeans there. Because peace is not about anybody else but the big powers. And I found this, always big powers have been more equal than others. But they have been always pretending that this is not the case. And we were talking a lot about the hypocrisy of the liberal order, and this hypocrisy is very real. But Judith Clark has something very great book called The Ordinary Vices. This is an important hypocrisy. And then somebody comes and said, listen, you can be dying, but it does not mean that you should be on the table. And I do believe this is a major change. And when you are saying the Ukrainians, for example, they feel better than the Americans and so on, probably. But honestly speaking, I do believe it's going to be really tough for Ukraine. Because they're going to be probably one of the preconditions that I see is that they, in order to have a ceasefire, by the way, the peace settlement, if the leaking is right, should be signed on May 9. Believe me, this was not Trump's idea. Yeah. So you're doing this, and then you're going to have elections. And I don't know, is President Zelensky going to run or not? But symbolically, This is very much about everything that you are seeing. And then you have the decision, most probably as a part of the peace negotiations, that Ukraine should lift the martial law, which means that men should travel. And in my view, the other story is you're talking about land and so on. For me, the problem of this fear of depopulation, very strong on the Russian side. I could be wrong. I do believe one of the things that we saw in this war was hunting for people and people who are kind of... but the other is you're going to see territories without people. And suddenly all the talk is about natural resources. You're not talking about people anymore. You're talking about rare materials and so on and so on. So something dramatically is also changing on this. And I'm very much interested how it looks from Ukraine, because if you're going to see how much this has changed, if you're going to see how for Europeans this is an issue, and does not want how to think about this. And also I'm interested, coming from there, what Europe should do. Because Europeans, we are unhappy, but to be honest, we like to be unhappy. So we're saying why we are not invited, but if you're a European leader, what you'll do? You're coming from Ukraine, you now see basically what is the thing discussed between the American and the Russian leaders. If you're a European leader, what you'll do?
Okay, that covered a lot of territory, and I'm gonna just try to deal with it separately, because I don't think I have the wisdom to bring everything together. I want to say that with Musk, I don't think it's I think it's more than that. Some of us, some of us deserve to be saved, right? Some of us deserve to go to Mars or live forever, and that other of us are less worthy as humans. I think the project is more just to treat as a default human beings as not being human beings. And I think that the political system that he is trying to build is based on the notion that human beings are just one more input, like they're just one more part of a larger machine, and they're not privileged. They're not privileged over any other kind of they're not privileged over an algorithm or a circuit or whatever. They're just part of a larger system. And I do think this can be connected. I'm trying to connect this to America and how we think about things, but I really do think this can be connected to an idea of negative freedom, not just in the sense that you're opposed to the government, but also if you're in a negative freedom world, like if you think of freedom as just being against things, then it's not that hard to go from there to thinking about human beings as just being against creatures, like creatures that are against things. If you're just against stuff, then you don't necessarily have any dignity. You're just against stuff. And so if human beings are just against creatures, who are one day they're against the government, the next day they're against migrants and so on, it's not hard for someone like Musk to look at that and say, okay, these creatures are against creatures. What difference does it make whether I manipulate them to be against something else? They don't have any dignity. They're just things that bounce off other things. They just oppose stuff. So what's wrong with that? Why is it wrong to plug them into my system and to teach them that they should hate migrants, they should hate the government, they should hate migrants? What's wrong with that? Because that's just the kind of creatures that they are. And I'm trying to say that that's not so inconsistent with American ideas which were already present, which defined freedom as being against things. And if that's all we are, we're just against stuff, it's a pretty small step to say, okay, well then it's government's job to tell us what we should be against. And if Musk is running a giant scam, which I believe he is, to turn the American taxpayer into someone who just pays, by way of the US Treasury directly into Musk's pocket, what's wrong with that if all we are is against creatures? We don't have so if it makes us feel like we're opposing migrants by giving money to Musk, what's wrong with that? Who cares? And so like the system that he's designed, like Twitter is a very good example, is basically like that. Like it basically designs us, it helps us to hate other people and give Musk money. And I think that in some sense is what's actually, I think in some deep sense, something like that is what is actually going on. because Musk doesn't actually hate migrants. I mean, I think he does as a person, but obviously not as a businessman. And like one thing which is going to be interesting to watch if Musk captures AfD is whether AfD is then allowed to have a migrant policy, because Musk and all of his brother oligarchs, they hire illegal immigrants. That's their thing. They don't actually oppose immigration. In fact, it is just that they have realized that technically, algorithmically, statistically, probabilistically, this is the issue which best serves to create an us and them. So I think for Musk, it's kind of both. I think he actually doesn't like, people with brown skin or black skin or whatever. But beyond that, it's just an instrument. And so the funny, like an irony is that you don't actually end up, and like the Trump administration will not, I'll be surprised if they deport more people than the Obama administration did. What they're doing right now is they're deporting about the same number as the Biden people, but they're making a big spectacle of it. It's all for show, and the show is to get people to hate each other, right? To get us to be afraid of the government, afraid of the migrants, right? It's all part of treating us as a part of this fear machine. And at the end of the logic of the fear machine is where you have a government which no longer provides you any services. It just teaches you who you should be afraid of, and for that you pay taxes. But there's no government at the end of where you pay taxes. There's just Elon Musk. I think that's the fantasy, and I think that's a fantasy which is maybe precedes going to Mars or precedes immortality. But I think it's maybe the more proximate fantasy, and it's the one which is in fact unfolding before our eyes. As far as immortality, I think you're right. Not that so many people believe in it, but that many important people believe in it, and I would add one aspect to this. I think it's death that actually makes it possible for us to be free. Because if you know you're going to die, so I was at Davos before a few weeks ago, and I was at this history session, a lunch session, and we were talking about similar issues, and I got a question from someone at my table, and she said, well, do you know, is there any hope, or are we all going to die? And my answer was, we are all going to die. And that's why there's hope, right? Because it's the fact that we're going to die which allows us to take risks. It allows us to think, okay, what would I do? Like having a child, to take Yvonne's example, is a risk for a woman, right? And if you're never going to die, is that a risk that you would take? You'd certainly think about it differently. Again, following Yvonne's reasoning. But if you're a guy, and most of the people are guys, if you think you're not going to die, you become a coward on a scale which was previously impossible. Because the thing that you think you have to lose, indefinite life, is of a different quality than a life of 50 years or 70 years or 90 years. And so what you get is people who, however they perform, ultimately have to be trying to live in a bubble and not engage anything else and have to be incredibly fearful. And so I think immortality, the idea of immortality injects a huge amount of anxiety into society. Like it takes the very wealthy and it turns them into anxiety magnifiers. Instead of being calm and happy about the things they've achieved in life, they're trying to achieve this thing which is impossible. And even if it were achievable, it would mean every moment of your day is full of anxiety, because at every moment you could get hit by a car or whatever, and then you lose, your godlike status. Okay, so much for immortality. So on Ukraine and America, I just want to be really clear. I wasn't trying to say that Ukrainians are better off than Americans or anything like that. I was trying to say that in this particular moment, it's striking to me how one experiences signs of freedom there, where things, as you say, are obviously much worse off now and in the future. It's interesting and in some sense reassuring to see people who are not looking to Trump and Putin and saying, oh, whatever Trump and Putin does is what's going to happen, which I find distressing in democratic societies. I find it distressing, and I'm getting to how Europe can react. I find it distressing that this is predictably how the media will cover all this. What will Trump do? What will Putin do? What will the big strong men do? Oh wait, they haven't done anything. But let's not do anything because our activity is to wait and see what the big strong men do. That is not a democratic attitude. It's not an attitude of free people, and I find it very worrying. I mean, I'm not trying to say it's not important what they do. I'm just trying to say that treating them as the only subjects in the story is a way of taking responsibility from yourself. And that's just my introduction to what Europeans should do. So my analysis of the situation, which is, Ivan said at the very beginning in his joke, it's really hard to predict these things because Trump and Putin are a little bit unpredictable, and will there still be people in South Korea at the time of their summit, or will they have depopulated themselves completely by then? Can they meet in South Korea at these rates of depopulation? But it's unpredictable. But here's what I think. My gut feeling is ceasefire possible, peace plan much less likely. And so, historically, if you look at big conflicts and how they end, it just isn't true that big conflicts end with complicated treaties that regulate everything, right? Just to stay with South Korea, that's not how the Korean War ended. The Korean War is still going on. And that hasn't prevented South Korea from becoming, in many respects, an incredibly enviable society. The Second World War did not have a peace treaty at the end of it. It didn't. That's why Austria is the way it is, a series of compromises. But there was no peace treaty, and that's why West Germany was the way that it was. I mean, West Germany was the way that it was because there wasn't a peace treaty, and then that enabled the Americans to do certain things, which allowed Germany to become, let's call it, a society of free people. And that's where here's what I think Europeans have to do. The other reason I don't think a peace treaty is very likely is because a peace treaty, and I would love to be wrong about this, but I think a peace treaty involves levels of patience and knowledge, which the US government no longer has. I have no doubt that the Russians have templates for the peace treaty. And I also have no doubt that quite a few Americans at the top of my government would be happy to just sign those things. But since the United States is not a party to this war, Americans just signing things doesn't end the war. So whatever the peace treaty is, it has to involve the Ukrainians in some way, and I'm sure the Russian templates are outrageous, and I'm afraid that the Americans don't really have the wherewithal to engage in something like peace negotiations. I think that Trump sees this transactionally, and the transaction is, I go to Putin, we shake hands, we sign paper, we hug, there are pictures, and then I get the Nobel Peace Prize. That was not a joke. That's the reality. That's the reality. So, but I think ceasefire maybe they can manage, and ceasefire is the opportunity for Europe, because unlike a peace treaty, which would have some of the things that Ivan enumerated, a ceasefire would be, I think, unlikely to include issues like sanctions on Russia, or Ukraine has to hold elections, or things like that. Peace treaty, yes. Ceasefire, I don't see it. I'd be insane for Ukraine to agree to a whole list of things like that just in exchange for a ceasefire, which they don't believe the Russians are going to keep anyway. So I think ceasefire equals once in a generation opportunity for Europeans to be active. Because if there is a ceasefire, it will not prevent you from inviting Ukraine to join the European Union, which you should do the next day, essentially. It will not prevent you, again, if it's a ceasefire, not a treaty, it will not prevent you from stationing troops on Ukrainian soil if it's just a ceasefire. It certainly won't prevent you from encouraging private investment and from working on Ukrainian rebuilding in general. So if there is a ceasefire, that is the moment of European agency. That is the opportunity for Europe, and only for Europe, only the Europeans can do this, because the Americans don't have the attention span, the willingness, or the development agency. I mean, as you probably noticed, right? So we don't have the will or the policy instruments. And the Russians, of course, just see the ceasefire as a way to buy time to invade Ukraine again. So if there is a ceasefire, the only way that Europeans can turn history is to say, okay, we know the Americans aren't going to do anything. We know the Russians are just buying time to invade. We know if they do that, that's a war that's going to involve us without the Americans and with a weakened Ukraine. So we have to go in our own interests and strengthen this country. That is what you should do in your own interests. And I've spent the last 3 weeks trying to make this case to Europeans in various European capitals, and I'm worried because, and here's why I'm worried. I'm worried because I think that too many Europeans, not all, but too many Europeans are in the narrative of whatever Trump and Putin do, we then wait for the next thing that they do. And if Trump and Putin get to ceasefire, and then the European narrative is, oh, that's nice, life has been saved, and now let's wait for Trump and Putin to do peace treaty. If that's what you do, then all that will happen will be that Ukraine will be distracted in many ways, you'll be distracted, the Americans will go back to destroying their own government, and Russia will invade Ukraine again in 9, 12, 15 months, and then you will really have a problem. Then you will really have a problem. And there won't be the Americans there to help you. Right? They're gone. The Americans are gone. They will not be there to help you. So the only way to head that off is to take advantage of ceasefire to try to build up the Ukrainian state. So that's like, and in some sense, like this is what Europe should be planning to do regardless. Because if there is a ceasefire, these resources build up Ukraine. If there isn't a ceasefire, these resources put the Ukrainians in a better position to deal with whatever the Russians and the Americans come up for them down the line. So like, this has been said many times. Like in Yugoslavia, it was said like, this is Europe's hour and so on. I realize like Europe's hour has rung many times, right? Like that bell has been cracked. But this time, I think it's real. I think this time, this is Europe's hour. If there's a ceasefire, but not a peace treaty, that opens the moment and the opportunity where Europe can do the things it needs to do to save, not just the Ukrainians, but really to save themselves. I think that's the test, and not just because it's the right thing to do, but because if Europe doesn't pass it, there isn't going to be a Europe in the sense that you have Europe now. The Ukrainians, I mean, getting to analogies with the 1930s, the Ukrainians, and I agree with you, by the way, on all the differences that you pointed out between now and the 1930s. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that another striking difference is that in the 1930s, in the 1930s, fascists would have, put it a different way. The fascists of today are generally about 40 years older and not in the same kind of physical shape as the fascists of the 1930s. So if you look at January 6, 2021, like if you watch the video of Americans trying to storm the Capitol, I'm going to get myself killed for saying this, or else I won't because I'm in pretty good physical shape. I can run away. But like one of the main problems the guys had trying to storm the Capitol was that they just weren't in very good physical shape, right? Like as I was watching that, I was thinking, you know what? Like if this had been Germany in 1933, like they would have been in there like that, and the whole story would have been over, right? They would have caught Pence, they would have caught the senators, but the main thing slowing them down was those extra calories. And that because the police presence was really minimal, right? Like that, so that's a difference between now and the 1930s. Sorry, Ludger. See, you're laughing, right? If we're not supposed to joke, then you shouldn't be laughing. But the point of the 1930s analogy that I would hold on to is Czechoslovakia and Ukraine, where Czechoslovakia, like Ukraine, is it's an imperfect but nevertheless functioning democracy where people happen to speak more than one language. Czechoslovakia, like Ukraine, has sort of ambiguous alliance relationships with Western democracies. Czechoslovakia, like Ukraine, faces a big, powerful neighbor which says that it doesn't have the right to exist. Its state is the result of an illegitimate international settlement. Its people aren't really a people. The resemblance between what Hitler says about Beneš and Czechoslovakia to what Putin says about Zelensky and Ukraine is really striking, really striking. But the difference is that unlike the Czechoslovaks, the Ukrainians fight, which changes the whole moral balance because it makes appeasement harder, right? You can't, once the Ukrainians fight, it becomes harder for us to appease. And if the Ukrainians hadn't fought, everybody would have appeased. But because they didn't, it became harder to appease. And the Ukrainians fighting, as I see it, basically has made 1938 last for 3 years so far. Like they've kept the rest of you in 1938, which is not a great year, but it's better than 1939. And if you let the Ukrainians go, then, as it were, time flows forward again, and what you get is 1939.
We'll go for questions, but there are two things that I found very interesting. By the way, with Czechoslovakia, it's slightly Mine is slightly more complicated, because Czechoslovakia was not fighting when everybody else is fighting. And the problem of Ukraine is that they're fighting when nobody else is interested to fight. So in a certain way, part of the social contract for European societies is that we don't believe anymore that government has the right to ask you to die. And this is the major kind of a story. If you compare COVID with the war, during COVID, governments almost declared death unnatural. Somebody 93-year-old died and they said, how this is possible? And then now, basically, you should tell young people that this is what is expected from them. So I do believe this was a kind of also part of the Ukrainian effect. But there was something about Trump that I found really interesting. It's slightly probably more interesting that we're ready to acknowledge. Americans since Vietnam have understood that the problem of the empire is not how you get in, but how you get out. It's the art of exit. This was the problem in Vietnam, it was Biden in Afghanistan, which probably contributed to this and that. And this is Trump. The best way to exit is to pretend to exit when you are not in. In a certain way, what is funnily enough, there is no American military presence.
That sounds like a masculinity problem, what you just said.
Yeah, but but this is extremely important, because this is post-imperial politics. It's highly theatrical. You have the feeling that America is withdrawing, but in a certain way, it's not withdrawing because it's not there. In a certain way, in Vietnam, they were there. In South Korea, they were there. I mean, they were American soldiers. And something is happening of this. By the way, Russia also has changed dramatically. Our kind of remembrance of Russia is always the World War II. It's very heroic, people dying, you know the names of the generals, soldiers, and so on. Russia, in a certain way, is recruiting totally by money. And this is one of the reasons people do not have much of a sympathy for huge casualties that they have, because they said, this is the professional risk. If you're in this business, you're dying. I'm saying this because there is some perverse version of the idea of the post-heroic society in different styles. Everybody is a post-heroic, the war is there, and of course technology is there. And my last point before going to your question is, when we talk about oligarchs, I do believe we're very much pushing on money as if money is important for them. And my feeling is I cannot imagine, but for somebody like Musk, money does not exist. If you're in billions, money does not exist. Money, and by the way, it's very interesting because if you see also his companies, the interesting about Musk is that what he's doing, he's consuming future. He has companies which some of them are not producing, does not have much profits these days, but the capitalization of the company is based on the fact what you expect that they're going to earn in the next 40 years. So from this point of view, he's slightly like Stakhanov. He's living in a different time. He's basically already cashed cars that have never been produced. All the capital, this is the value of the company is something that is happening in the future. And I do believe that there is something that is changing, and I very much agree with your idea about death and mortality, and that death makes us free. The story is that you have conquered the future, the past is not there anymore, so you don't know what to do in time. And in my view, there is a problem of time, and I'm sure that some of you are going to ask much more important questions on this, but it's not that they're there simply to buy more. I do believe we made this mistake with all the analysis of the Russian oligarchs, believing that they're so much about money that if you're basically going to take their money out, they're going to change their policies. It didn't work like this. There is something wrong with this economic thinking when you go on these levels of power. It's about something else, but I could be totally wrong. So we have 5 questions, and probably we can get all 5 at the same time. So basically, we can decide which to answer on the base, which are the easiest. Yeah, so please.
I want to admit that I was a little frustrated during the first hour. We were talking a lot about Putin, Musk, and Trump, and my sense was that we ought not to do that so much.
Yeah.
And I became very interested after an hour when we started focusing more on Ukraine and more what the Europeans ought to do. you're talking about a lot of narratives and some players, and I think there are others. The Europeans are really important. The question is, too, a little bit, what's going to happen in the next 72 hours in Munich? And when thinking about that, I think it's also important to think about what the Mexican president has done, what the Canadian prime minister has done, and also how something like a resistance is developing in the United States. It seems like we've kind of discounted the 49% of people who voted who didn't vote for Trump. And they're not sitting on their behinds right now. They're up doing things and talking about next steps. And so I'm curious, within that context, what do we think will happen during the next 72 hours in primarily in Munich, where we're trying to decide, are we going to continue with the post-war focus on international law, human rights, the rule of law in general, or are we going to give away the Ukrainians in this process of saying what Trump and Putin do with their authoritarian regimes, that's the new paradigm. That's the primary change. New paradigm, or are we going to be able to defend international law, human rights, and what we thought was so important after World War II?
Thank you so much. Please. Tom.
Thank you for this insightful conversation and discussion. I have a question to Tim Snyder, but first a brief comment. With immortality and nerds, if you ask any nerd at any age and in any history, or people fans of cyberpunk, they will tell you stories about digital immortality. So I think with Musk, it's the other way around. It was first the idea of immortality that drove him to that economic power that he has. But now a question, and I would like you to zoom in domestic American politics. Unlike in Russia, there is still opposition, the Democratic Party, although it now seems very depressed, and they ran along with all those confirmations of the people nominated by the Trump administration. But my question is, I think during the Biden era, there was a feeling in the Democratic Party that Trump was an aberration. And probably because of that, there was not enough of soul-searching inside the Democratic Party. And what do you think its strategy will be now? What meta-narratives can they come up with to challenge Trump? Because he does have a meta-narrative. He does have a story. It may be a fantasy, but this fantasy is really driving many, many people in the US and also outside of the US. So what's going to be the democratic response, in your opinion? Thank you.
Thank you. Please. There is a question there.
If we get away from the famous men in history examples, I would like to know which systems are more resilient. And I'm an American, so I've always believed in the resilience of the American system. So which systems are more resilient if you have a choice between the United States, Russia, and China? And Europe, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, there are two more, yeah, please.
I can try with
Yeah. No.
It's for the internet. You should.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Since you brought up the end of the Roman Empire, is there a lesson to learn from the end of the Holy Roman Empire?
There was the last question is.
Last question is a small one. It's about the world order. So the new game in town is realism. Mersheimer, Stephen Walt was here in this room talking under the title, Can We Create a Better World Order? You discussed with him, Ivan. This is, so to say, the might is right, we divide the world into spheres of influence, etc., which is the exact opposite of the world order that was existing perhaps up until 2014, built on the Helsinki Final Act, which is 50 years ago this year. It's based on the founding agreement in Paris, on the OSCE, etc., where every nation has the right to decide its own future. So, but the new game in town is this realist view that goes back. A lot of people are now talking about Yalta, but you could just as well go back 210 years to this city where people not far from here, they didn't just dance, they divided the world into spheres of influence and restored old powers. So my question is now, what is the selling point of this realist proposal for the world order? Why should we accept that as opposed to the normative one? Why would we try to, is it just realism? It's just facing up to the fact, or are there arguments here? Is that peace? Is that, what is that?
Thank you. So,
You want to go first, or?
you take Morris.
Okay. So let me start with the first one. I'm going to try to kind of synthesize the questions and also respond to some of Ivan's final remarks, which were characteristically really interesting. And lest I forget to do so, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be able to speak with Ivan privately and publicly, and how much I've gotten from these conversations over the years. I'm really grateful. I think, Carl-Henrik, the fundamental answer to your question is in your question. So realism is idealism. It pretends to be it pretends to be like the real man's, unbiased view of the way the world actually is, and so on. But realism is just idealism. If it weren't, the realists wouldn't have to write their papers. I mean, the realists spend their careers trying to persuade policymakers that policymakers should follow their idea of the way the world is. They're idealists. They have an idea of the way the world works. They have, and they can't quite agree on exactly what it is, but I mean, the notion that might is right is also an ideal. Because it is not in fact an accurate description of the world. Lots of other things happen, right? But the notion that might is right is one of these incredibly, it's one of these appealing, elegant oversimplifications, which will always have followers because there will always be people who look for simple formulae that explain everything. But intellectually, its weakness is that it is, as you suggest, it is an ideal. And so then the question logically is might being right, is that the ideal you want? Or do you prefer a different ideal? Because once you understand that realism is just one idealism of an infinitude of possible other idealisms, then it's perfectly reasonable to ask, okay, perhaps we should have a different idealism. How about might makes right 99% of the time? That sounds better than 100%, right? And just work from there. So in my view, it is childish to say one can separate power from principle, because even the people who exercise huge amounts of power in the name of what they would call state interests or whatever have a very special and irreducibly human notion of what those state interests are, right? There is no reality in that sense. And so once you, again, I'm making the same point in a different way, but once you accept that power and principle are always organically and inseparably connected, then you can reasonably ask, well, what's the best way to relate power and principle? And can you put some power behind certain principles so that they stick in certain ways? And we know that you can. For example, a justice system is an example of that, right? We have a justice system in Austria. The Austrian press every day tells us about the exceptions, which proves the rule, which is that in fact the justice system generally works. You can put power behind certain kinds of principles, and you can create a system that reproduces itself over generations and changes the world, right? Law is an example of that. Law exists. Law is just as real as missiles, if not more. And so my answer to your question is that I think it's reasonable to ask whether it's very reasonable to ask whether you can just inherit principles from Helsinki or 1945 or any other point. I don't think you can. I think you have to be asking all the time, given the realities of human life and psychology and so on, how you put the power and the principles together. But I think that is an unavoidable discussion. And those of us who claim that there is just a reality and the reality is just power, they're making their contribution to that discussion. I don't think it's a very interesting contribution, and I think it has to be understood just as a contribution rather than somehow some sort of finalization, which leads me to what the realism argument actually means in the world. So the people making the realist arguments, like in the setting that Ivan and I have been talking about right now, the ones who say, well, Russia's a great power, therefore it should, therefore we're just going to like not paying attention to Ukraine. I mean, I think they are generally people who admire the Russian structure and think like the Russian structure should also be normative for them. If Donald Trump is someone who openly admires the people we've been calling oligarchs and structures like the Russian one. And I think that is broadly speaking true of the people around him as well. And so when they say like Russia should win because Russia's big, I think they're really saying something much more like Russia should win because we would prefer that, given our own values, that countries like Russia should dominate the world, because we would like to be in a world like that. We would like to, and that's a value judgment, and then you can just discuss whether Trump's values are the right values, but they don't flow from reality in a natural way. And the next thing I want to point out is that this kind of realism, like looking around the world and saying, oh, well, that country's powerful, we're going to let it do what it does, that kind of realism seems to induce weakness rather than strength. If you look at the U.S., I mean, the U.S. posture towards Russia right now is startling in its submissiveness. I mean, it's like to a historical degree, given how much more powerful the United States is than Russia in pretty much every conceivable index of power. And given that Russia is really not doing very well in this war, which is something that we didn't really talk about, given all of that, it's quite extraordinary for the United States to waltz in and essentially say, we are going to preemptively accept all of the major Russian negotiating positions, even though we're not a party to the war. And even though there's no reason why we have to do this, and even though this violates every principle of how anyone ever would have been taught to negotiate, we're still going to walk in and essentially surrender on every major point, right? That's a startling level of submissiveness. And I think it's really striking how, this is like to extend the point of what kind of imperial world we're in and what it means to be post-imperial. Like Russia is fighting Ukraine and making itself far weaker with respect to China, which is strategically, I don't think this gets talked about enough, but if one were to think that Russia was really like realist in the sense of national interests or state power, invading Ukraine was, I think, disastrous in the sense that with respect to another great power, China, they're much weaker. And then you have the Americans, so Russia's being weaker than it has to be. And then you have the Americans upping, or is it lowering the ante, by pretending that they're weaker than the Russians, which is a crazy position to take, right? And so it's as though everyone is competing to be weaker, in fact. And so once you realize that, then you have to ask, is there really such a thing as state interest in the sense that the realists are? See, I'm trying to answer all the questions in like with answering one question. Is there really a state interest in the sense that the realists talk about? Or going back to some of the themes that Ivan has raised and I've been trying to pursue about people with lots of money, is it rather the case that people with insane amounts of money do not see the world in terms of interests, let alone state interests, but see the world in terms of narcissistic projections involving grand goals like being the next Catherine the Great, or being immortal either in the Putinist sense of being remembered forever, or being immortal in the literal sense, as, and I take your point, Anton, in the literal sense of just of physically living forever. That state interest, that you really actually can't explain Putin's fantasy about Ukraine or Musk's fantasies about America in terms of state interests, because they don't care about the state and they don't really see the world in terms of interests. That's like it's a comfortable thing, but it isn't really true. And Ivan, I can't help but mention when it comes to owning the future, I mean, what Musk is doing, he has this like fantastic rhetoric about, everybody's competitive and so on, but he's basically trying to turn the United States into a state socialist system, right? He's trying to turn the United States into a state socialist system in which he owns everything. I mean, it's
Soviet power and electrification of the country.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like today, the United States bought $400 million of armored Teslas or whatever they are, and those things are totally useless. Like They're useless in the battlefield. They're useless on the road, and so he's taking over government power and using it to prop up his own companies. And he owns the future, in the same sense that, the Soviet factory that produced ball bearings owned the future. Yes, they're going to get all the government contracts. But what one shouldn't delude about oneself about is that this has anything to do with competition, right? It has to do with turning the government into the instrument of something which is very much like state socialism, in one of the ironies. And then to Anton's question about the Democrats and soul searching, I think one needs to distinguish, and this goes to your question too. One has to distinguish the Democrats from opposition. There will be opposition, and there is opposition, but I think it's a mistake. It's a little bit of a mistake to say, let's see what the Democratic Party is going to do, because the Democratic Party is going to learn from other institutions and other organizations and other people. There's no way, and I say this with respect for the many things they're good at doing, but they're not going to be people who are going to be out front defining what opposition is, with the exception of a few progressives in the House and a couple of progressives in the Senate. There aren't Democrats who are even really talking very clearly about what is happening. So they will be pulled along by other people. And the more, it's not the case that the 49% who didn't vote for Trump are all resisting now. That's not true at all. I think what's more likely to happen is that there will be new coalitions of people who are dissatisfied for different reasons, and that by the summer of 2025, we're going to see different forms of organic opposition where the Democrats are following along. So Anton, I would distinguish between the Democrats' loss in November and the situation they're facing now. Because I think their loss in November triggered the situation that we're in now, but I think their loss in November only tangentially has to do with the problems that we're facing now. And so I worry a tiny bit that when the Democrats say, well, we have to figure out why we lost in November before we can resist Trump, I think that agenda is not in the right order. And I think even if they did figure out why they lost in November, and Yvonne would probably have more clever ideas than me, they're going to come up with, we lost in November because it was a bad year for incumbents. We lost in November because the digital terrain was tilted against us. And those things I think would be correct. But none of that stuff is going to give you immediate prescriptions for how to resist. And the resistance in the US, and this goes back to this notion that America has institutions, and the institutions are reliable. I'm not a big believer in that. I think that belief has been really deadly for us especially in the last few weeks, because every sentence that began with America's institutions basically was an invitation to do nothing, and we don't have that much time, frankly. So anyway, I think the opposition, when it comes, is going to come from unexpected places. It's going to come from labor unions. It's going to come probably from students, and it's probably going to come from unexpected coalitions that include Trump voters. I mean, if it's going to be meaningful, it's going to have to include Trump voters, because it's not going to be all Harris voters. It's going to be people who are upset by things, who didn't know they were going to be upset by things, with people who knew they were going to be upset by things. And an awful lot's going to happen in the US. We're going to have consequences of the things that are happening right now over the next few months, which are going to be surprising, even for the people who are planning them. So I can't tell you how they should soul search. Because even so there were people like me who said that we are risking a regime change, right? If the Democrats had said that, would they have gotten more votes? I don't know, honestly. I didn't think so at the time, to be honest with you. But it was true, it was true, right? And now we're facing the results. So what they should have said back then to win, and what they need to do now are kind of two different issues. And I think connecting them too firmly in a way becomes an excuse for them not to think radically about the moment that they're now in. And one thing that they should be thinking about is how, if there are going to be elections in 26 and 28, if this is a chance for, I guess this is my one thing, this is the chance for Democrats to profile themselves. Because if you do something interesting in this moment, you'll be remembered. This is a chance to be remembered.
Just three very short points, because it's really very interesting for me. One is, the change is so big that Trump is going to change the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party which is going to face him is going to be different than the one that was before. And to be honest, it's not simply that he won with not such a big difference. In the last weeks, Trump is becoming more popular with the voters. And many of the kind of policies, at least this is what the polling shows. So he's a polarizing and popular, which is different, because I very much agree with Tim. Institutions are going to resist if they have the feeling that majority is on their side. If basically people in the institutions believe that 60% of the population is somewhere else, they're going to behave differently. Because the public opinion is not something that can be discounted in democracy. And on the story, which I very much agree, and also to defend slightly Stephen here, because the problem of the realists, if you go to the much more enlightened realists, because you cannot call Musk realists, he's doing regime change every day by tweets. He goes and telling Germans for whom to vote and so on. This is not a realism. It's not about the idea of sovereignty. But the idea is that our societies are changing a lot. And suddenly we know everything that is happening in the world. And don't forget, our solidarities are selective. You cannot be in a solidarity with every conflict that you have. And in our societies, there are so many people coming from different places. In a certain way, Europe is going to stay with Ukraine if it stays, mostly because of the Ukrainians which are in our societies and people that you know. This is not the abstract interest of Europe, because Europe is a different place. Portuguese does not feel particularly threatened by Russia. And as a result of it, what is changing, and for people like Stephen Walt, one of the interesting stories, what you're doing in a world in which there is no information sovereignty, anybody can enter your political space. And by the way, before small countries, we were protected by our small languages. It's not easy to come and campaign in Bulgarian. But now with artificial intelligence, it's done. Everybody comes and you don't know who is speaking. And as a result of it, you have a democracies. And the democracies basically are very much also governed by the moves of people, so what you're doing. And if you go just back to Helsinki, it sounds good on a normative level, but Helsinki was about a regime in which it was the authoritarian regimes that were closing their borders. In a certain way, even during the war, the Russians didn't close their borders. We are much more under the pressure to close the borders. It's a different type. And this combination of movement of capital, where they go anywhere and can leave any moment, movement of people, all these bad things about globalization suddenly have been weaponized. And I agree very much with Tim. The state is a fiction, particularly for some of the small countries. But people like Stephen Walt try to basically bet on this fiction because they don't believe that we have a better fiction in order to discuss in which all, even small states are on the table. And this is really a kind of a difficult story what to do in this world in which everybody can affect anybody. And here now I have something really important to say. And this is going really to impact your life. And this is that we have a wine and cheese after the end of our conversation. And thank you for Tim and thank you to you.
So I want to add my thanks, but I also want to say something about Europe, because